So with that, I'm going to jump into our first panel. We have the Forest and Carbon Sequestration panel. This panel will discuss the connection between forests and climate change and how pro-forestation may be the answer to solving negative climate change impacts. Panelists will go into how open space and tree canopy cover is an equity issue and what's happening with urban tree planting initiatives, as well as the funding mechanisms needed to support equitable preservation across the state. So we have Susan Masino, did I correct that? Masino from Trinity College, Colleen Murphy-Dunning from the Yale School of Forestry, and Amy Blaymore Paterson from the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. And I'll start with Susan.
Hi, good morning. I'm really honored to be here. The title of this is somewhat forests and carbon, but it really should be forests in our future. So I've thought about this for a long time. I'm a professor here at Trinity College. I'm a neuroscience professor and I run a biomedical research lab. But I've been an advocate for forests and all the values that forests provide in Connecticut for about 15 years. And last year, during my sabbatical that I had from Trinity College, I applied for a fellowship at Harvard Forest to do a collaboration between Harvard Forest and Harvard Medical School on forests and brain health to try and actually pull in some of this really important information on our mental and physical health, harm reduction, and how we really need to approach our forests and the natural world with an ethos of first do no harm, which is the ethos that I bring to my research laboratory and my biomedical career. I'm also the spokesman for Keep the Woods, which work to preserve a core forest, a keystone forest in Simsbury, and currently on the Open Space Commission in Simsbury, and I'm the Hartford County Coordinator for the Old Growth Forest Network, and I'm the president of the Connecticut State Grange Foundation. So I'm really have been trying to talk to a lot of different constituencies and look at this problem from a lot of different directions. And the first thing I'm going to do is channel something that Gina McCarthy said at the Bushnell during the climate crisis event at the Connecticut Forum. And she said, what kind of a future do you want to have? And I would suggest that we all want a future that involves nature, that has a strategic network of nature to protect the library of evolution, to serve all of the public, to protect our water resources, and to prevent extinction. And this is something that we need to be proactive right now about protecting. I'd also like to say that I have great respect for the environmental community in Connecticut, and I think it's better than any other state that I've lived in or worked in. We're very united. We work together to help each other to address problems that we know affect all of us. And we're very connected, and we really approach this from kind of a common purpose. And we need this more than ever to try and all look at each other's problems and attempt to try and solve our environmental problems from a perspective of multi-solving. So multi-solving is important and urgent because multi-solving solutions protect the climate for the long term and also provide multiple co-benefits today. Forests are an incredible example of multi-solving. Multi-solving solutions connect us to the natural world and connect us to each other, something that we need more than ever. And they save time and energy and often money. So today, Connecticut is very blessed with 60% of our state covered in forests. But we have the least amount of reserved forests in the region. We may be taking our forests for granted, which is why we need to be very proactive about protecting a strategic network. New York has the highest amount of reserved forest because over 100 years ago they protected the Adirondacks with a level of protection similar to a national park. Connecticut has no national parks. We need to consider treating some of our natural areas, some of these key areas, like we would treat a national park. And I would like to make it very clear that I'm advocating for 3 different types of forests. We need forests for resources that we all use, and we should set up local systems that provide the most local jobs and circular systems that keep money and resources in our local communities. We need forests for research, for different types of forestry, for different types of habitats that we may want to try and create or maintain. And we need forests for nature. So we need these 3 different kinds, and while there may be some overlap, we can't forget the last kind, the forests that we really need to protect for nature. Forests evolved before dinosaurs, and you may have found that they just discovered the oldest forest ever discovered is in New York State, with complex root systems and connectivity, 385 million years old. So my main points are that for broad benefits for the climate, for biodiversity, and for our health, we need to protect more forests, and we need to better protect some of the forests that we already own. We need a balance among these different types of forests, and we need to align our actions with the ethos of first do no harm. So there's a couple of other pieces of information I would really like everyone to take away from this, and these are echoed in some of the materials in your folder. Any type of manipulation or management results in a net loss of carbon from the forest. It could be for years, it could be decades, it could be centuries, depending on what that is. So we need to have a good reason to be taking down our trees and cutting down and manipulating our forests. Reforestation is a term for letting our existing forests grow to their full ecological and structural potential. Forests will naturally diversify in their ecology and their structure over time. And it's another type of natural climate solution like reforestation or afforestation that can help us to address climate change and protect biodiversity. Natural climate solutions are the key to solving this crisis. Even if we converted to all renewable energy, if we have a zero carbon budget, if we don't protect nature, what do we really have? We have a crisis with our insects and all kinds of species that we're not even really documenting on a very long-term basis. We need more science. We need interdisciplinary science applied to these problems. As Mark Silk said, we should stop spending public money burning wood as renewable energy. So we have better uses for our public subsidies that are intended to solve our climate solutions. In terms of biodiversity, wilderness reduces the rate of extinction by half. We need core areas and we need connected areas so species can survive, species that need intact core areas, and species that are going to need to migrate northward as we face the increasing pressure of climate change. If we don't provide these core areas and these connections, we will be inadvertently extirpating species that we could have done very simple proactive things to protect. We need to recognize that there is extremely strong public support for this, and I brought a couple of little show and tell items, such as an article in the Hartford Courant that was titled "State Your Preferences." It interviewed 10 people of all types from across the state, and I believe it's either 8 or 9 out of the 10 people said that one of their 3 favorite things in Connecticut is our incredible state parks and natural areas and hiking. It's what brings people to Connecticut, and it's what keeps people in Connecticut. This was affirmed with an 85% vote to more strongly protect public land at the polls in, I think, 2017. So this is something we can do, and Connecticut is not unusual. There's extremely high bipartisan, nonpartisan support across the country, 80% support for national parks. A recent public opinion poll in southern New England showed 90% support for nature preserves and 99% support for protecting old-growth forest. Currently, old-growth forest has no special legal protection. We only have about 300 acres of it in Connecticut, maybe more if there's more on private land. But it's so precious. We need to value these things, and protecting them is so inexpensive compared to some of the other big things that we're trying to do. We have to really get on the same page about this. So I don't want to overstay my time, and I don't know what the timekeeper is saying, but I'd like to say that, pardon me?
You're good.
Okay, so I have a bunch more papers I could show, but basically they talk about public health in forests and how forests can reduce blood pressure, how forests can increase creativity, and how nature in general can promote a sense of awe. And this can happen in healthy people, it improves health in healthy people, and it also helps special populations like veterans. Suicide is a greater risk for a veteran to be dying than dying as part of a combat operation or being in the military. So mental health is one of the most important things that nature can provide. We're a heavily populated state. We need places for quiet and for refuge for people. And there are several examples of this around the state that have been very successful or could be very successful in protecting our forests for all of these values. So recently in Simsbury, we just protected Belden Forest as the first forest to be accepted into the old growth forest in the state. This could be something you could do in your town. See if there's an old forest that's publicly accessible. Maybe you might want to give it this designation and ensure that it will be a refuge for people to be there for people forever, because visiting the same place over and over again like a friend has additional benefits. There's a forest we should protect, Remington Woods, which is 422 acres and is owned, I believe, by DuPont. It's an oasis for the communities of Bridgeport and Stratford, and we need to find a different solution than turning that into an industrial park. We need to protect regional efforts. So in Western Connecticut, there's the Follow the Forest program, which basically identifies a corridor of core forest that goes all the way up to Canada. This is our corridor for migration with climate change. And there's another area in eastern Connecticut that has been identified as one of the top 100 places to designate a new national park.
Thank you, Susan. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're a little bit over time.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to move on to Colleen Murphy-Dunning.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to really shift gears. I know I am on a panel about forests, but I'm going to talk about cities. So what I'd like to share with you, I'm an urban forester based at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in New Haven. And what I'd like to share with you this morning is why cities are an important part of this conversation, then connect and broaden that to issues of equity, and then I will try to end on a more positive note, because I'm going to start out a little bleak, and end on a more positive note and connect to Brenda's points about harm reduction. So welcome to 2020. We are living in an urban century. This is the century where our globe is going to urbanize. Every year, the overall population grows on the planet, but it is also increasingly becoming urban as people migrate from rural areas to cities for economic opportunity. In 1800, which is not that long in terms of the, when you talk about the length of forests, back in 1800, only 3% of the world's population was urban. Today, over half of the population is urban, and by the year 2100, demographers expect that we will be 88% urban, meaning that there will be 9 billion people living in cities. The consequence of this urbanization is that we are converting forests and rural areas, habitat and agricultural land to urban land. There's a professor at the Yale School of Forestry named Dr. Karen Sito, and she's a geographer that uses satellite imagery and remote sensing, and I'm going to quote some of her data. She estimates that the built environment that will exist in just 2050, in the next 30 years, in the US, 65% of that has not yet been constructed. Meaning in the next 30 years, we will build more urban areas in the US than exist today. The shift of this land conversion from rural to urban is critical because of the long-lasting implications of greenhouse gas emissions from building and transportation infrastructure. Once we build it, it will be baked in. Cities are the hub of economic activity. About 80% of the world's economy comes in urban places. It also consumes about 70% of all the world's energy and produces about 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. The area, the land area impacted by urbanization is not just affected by population growth and movement to cities, but also a trend that is occurring across the planet of higher resource use per person. Not only are there more and more people on the planet, I told you I was going to be a little bleak, right? But we are also creating cities that once were natural areas, and we are using more energy per person. In the US, over the past 40 years, we have fewer people living per household. At the same time, in that 40-year period, the sizes of our households have grown from an average of 1,600 square feet to now 2,800 square feet. So what that means is we use more energy to cool and heat. And that energy consumption is part of what is driving climate change. So the US is the #1 per capita user of greenhouse gas emissions. China is #2 of all global, but because they have more people, we are #1 in terms of, as individuals, our per capita greenhouse gas emissions. The growth of cities is not only influencing climate change, but it is also impacted by climate change. And that is because the surface area, the dynamic of the surface area of cities, which is so much concrete from the buildings and the road networks, that surface area absorbs a great more deal of shortwave radiation compared to areas that are naturally vegetated, which creates more heat produced by cities with a phenomenon that is well understood called the urban heat island. So the combination of the heat island and an increase in global temperatures is going to result in very high temperatures in cities where 88% of us will live in the next 30 years. So on the plus side, where there are more trees, where there's open space, and there's less concrete and less impervious surface, such as parkland and other open spaces that you were just talking about, Susan, we do have lower temperatures. So there's a solution right in front of us. So I want to shift now and expand this to how this concern of increased impervious surface and built environment compared to tree cover and open space affects equity issues. Underlying social stresses create greater vulnerability for climate change. So all of us probably in this room have a visual imprint in our memory of Hurricane Katrina, of people in New Orleans that were so affected by that storm. Communities of poverty have fewer resources to escape the storm, and they also are less resilient to be able to respond to the aftermath of a storm. Another example of socially vulnerable communities are those affected by the urban heat island. I don't know if, I am from the Midwest, I'm from near Chicago, and I don't know if folks remember, back in 1995, there was a heat wave in Chicago in July. In a period of 5 days, 739 people died in the city of Chicago from heat. So far more than we have seen dying from flooding events. That's happened across Europe. That is going to increasingly happen, where we have catastrophic heat events, and the people who are most vulnerable are those who live without air conditioning ability to cool themselves.
Down to 1 minute. 1 minute.
Oh no, 1 minute. Okay, I'm gonna get to a positive picture really quickly. But my point of this is that they found very clear evidence by mapping the tree cover and the temperature data and the poverty data that these are very linked events. So we need to be very concerned in urban places how we can increase tree canopy cover and how we can increase urban open space so that that can reduce the problem of temperature. We have seen this in New Haven. We have done studies across the state and in New Haven that the tree cover is not equal. Poor neighborhoods have fewer trees. So we can reverse this. Tree planting is a very simple act, and we can address, and I want to quickly try to say about harm reduction, we can plant trees and we can involve both the general public in caring for those trees and create green jobs, as we have done in New Haven, hiring youth to plant trees and people who are returning from prison who are taught by Yale students to plant trees in New Haven. Sorry, I went over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I apologize that we didn't give you enough time. We can talk about this for a whole day. We're going to move on to Amy Blaymore Paterson.
Well, for those of you, is this on? Yes, is it on? Okay, I'm wasting precious time here. Here, I'll use this one. Okay. Now I'm going to talk even louder and faster. Okay, you can hear me now? Yes. Thank you. My name is Amy Paterson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. CLCC is the umbrella organization for Connecticut's land conservation community, and we work most predominantly with the state's very robust land trusts. We have over 130 in Connecticut, and they do a phenomenal job. So I'm going to go pretty rapid fire here, but I will say, and I want to thank the league for inviting me again, to speak about a topic that is a priority for CLCC and our conservation partners every year, and that is to protect and improve our land conservation funding programs. I was looking at my notes last night, and I realized that I do tend to say the same things every year, and that does mean that, number one, these programs are really important, and number two, that the challenges remain the same each and every year. But this year, I really do feel that there's even a greater sense of urgency than there has been in the past, and that is because of the climate crisis that we are facing. We have severely underestimated the ability of natural climate solutions, forests, marshlands, wetlands, farmland, to help mitigate the climate impacts. Those natural climate solutions absorb the carbon, but they also prevent the release of carbon when land is disturbed. So land conservation is critical in our ability to address this climate crisis. So what I'm going to do is just talk again about the programs that are very important to us here in the state of Connecticut, talk about some improvements, and hopefully, if I have some time, talk about some other ideas that maybe we can implement to increase the pace of land conservation, more strategically conserve land, and make sure that we're protecting the land that we have. So we do have some excellent programs here in Connecticut. The first one that I speak of all the time, because we advocate so heavily for it, is the Open Space and Watershed Land Acquisition Grant Program. That is run through DEEP. In fact, all of the programs I'm going to reference today are run through DEEP, but we do have others through the Department of Agriculture as well for farmland preservation. That program is a matching grants program. It's funded through bonding, and it's funded through the Community Investment Act, or the CIA, which I'll talk about in a minute. We recently, thanks to the support of all of you, we recently had an allocation of $5 million for that program, which enabled the governor to recently announce that another round of grants had been approved, and that we have 2,400 more acres conserved in Connecticut, which is terrific. If you haven't thanked the governor, if you haven't thanked your legislators, if you haven't thanked Commissioner Dykes, please do, because support for this program is critical to our land conservation efforts. Bonding is inconsistent. It's tough for us to rely upon it year after year, and so we have to rely upon the Community Investment Act to fund the Open Space Grant Program. That program is funded through, it's a state program, but it's funded through a $40 surcharge at the local level on recording fees. So when you take a deed into the land records and you record it, they're going to slap on an additional $40. Most of that money, a few dollars, stays with the town. Most of it goes up to the state and is divided amongst 4 programs: open space, farmland, affordable housing, and historic properties preservation. The problem with that program is that it has been so successful. How many of you have heard of the CIA? And I don't mean, you know, those people running around with dark glasses and suits, right? So raise them high. Everybody in here should know about the CIA, because the CIA has benefited every community in Connecticut. And the problem with it as a continuous source of funding is that it is a very attractive target for being raided when we are facing budget shortfalls, which we have been for the last 5, 6, 7 more years. And so we have to fight year after year to protect that fund. It's a standalone, dedicated fund, and make sure that that money is not swept into the general fund and thereby lost for the purposes that it was set out to protect. I have 3 minutes. Okay. The other program that is funded through the Community Investment Act is the Urban Green and Community Garden Program. That is critically important for targeted and distressed communities that wish to create urban spaces, urban green spaces. Again, because it is funded through the Community Investment Act, it's at risk. When that money is rated from the CIA, then there's less available for that program as well. The Recreation and Natural Heritage Trust Program is a deep source of funding so that they can purchase land. It currently is very low on funds, if it has any at all. It was recently funded, but that through bonding. But again, bonding is very unreliable, and it needs more money. The Rec Trails and Greenways program is another program funded exclusively through bonding. So the theme here is that we are relying upon inconsistent funding sources through bonding, or we are relying upon a critically important, very robust funding source that is a constant source of targeting for rating. So we have to be on our toes, and one of your takeaways today is to be sure to advocate for those programs, get involved in your local community, make sure you see the projects in your town, celebrate them, invite legislators, talk about them, and enjoy them. They are critically important to all of us. Still needed. So these are programs that are in place now. What's needed as we go forward? How am I doing? 1 minute. So there are creative funding options that we really need. We need to be looking away from the state of Connecticut and looking more towards other options that municipalities in particular can adopt so that they will have funding streams themselves to invest in their local conservation efforts. For years, we have been trying to get a municipal funding option passed at the state level by way of enabling legislation. This, we've been calling it a municipal funding option for short. But this would be enabling legislation. It would not be a requirement. It would give towns that opt to use it the opportunity to adopt a buyer's conveyance fee program that would be limited both in terms of the percentage and in terms of the amount that could be imposed. Take the funding that is generated by that one-time fee, put it in a local fund to be used for land acquisition, for stewardship, for which, by the way, for stewardship of our open space lands, we don't have a state funding program that land trusts and towns can look to help manage our lands. And so this would be a local option for towns. They can use that money to help manage their funds. Last year, a bill was passed, I think it was 1062, and Senate Bill 1062, yes. And that enabled towns to set up an account for coastal resiliency funds. But if towns don't have, where's the source of funding going to come from? That's what I keep asking. Is it going to be a line item in the town's budget? Is it going to be, where's that money going to come from? A municipal funding option would give towns the opportunity to generate their own funds, to put in a coastal resiliency fund or for other environmental purposes without raising the bond, without raising the mill rate or needing to bond. It is so logical. Other states have done it. It has passed. It's working, and it enhances property values because open space will do that.
Thank you, Amy. I'm sorry.
You're welcome. Sorry, I had more to say, but
I didn't realize I was going to be the bad guy up here. Note to self. Sorry about that. Lori, where are you? So we're going to open it up to questions so that we can keep the program moving. And there are some folks with microphones in the audience. Oh, there's Lori. So if anyone has any questions for our panelists, this is the time. There's one question all the way in the back. Lori, a hand up back there.
And you might want to repeat the question because I'm not sure if it's going through the feed.
Okay.
So the heat wave in Chicago actually spurred the evolution of the green roof movement because EPA picked 5 different cities, including Chicago, to pilot green roofs in the United States, which help lower the urban heat island. There's a real need for the community, the environmental community, to recognize how to engage the design community and the development community for cities. Because right now, it's all about preserving these last fragments of land rather than understanding how do we build high-density cities. And I have to say, I'm coming from the design community, and I still feel like an outsider in the environmental community and an outsider in the design community because I'm looking at this in-between space. It's more than just a community garden. It's more than just planting a tree on a street. It's really understanding how do we keep healthy ecosystems within the cities, and that's more than a park that has athletic turf fields. So we need some work. The question is, how do we get the environmental community to work with the design community to look at what is a healthy ecosystem in a city?
I guess I'll take that one. My response is, I agree with you, Mary. We should be a interdisciplinary approach to solving these problems. It's not just the design community, it's the housing community. It's understanding the idea of harm reduction. I think is very important in terms of equity. How do we ensure that we're thinking about how we achieve better cities in the future that not only are more ecologically viable, but are also more equitable? And so how does it create employment? Addressing the idea of harm reduction. How does it address health? So it's not just the design professionals that should be involved, but the health professionals, educators, housing, all across many disciplines should be involved.
I just want to add, one of the things that is involved with land conservation, of course, at the local level is the whole land use planning process. And I think that it really behooves all of us to be involved with that process, whether it's involved with the Plan of Conservation and Development, getting involved with the local commission. I recently had an exchange with David Bingham, who I thought, there's David. It was just some comments about, why don't we start looking at our building footprints? I think we really need to be examining, and there might be a paradigm shift in how we're looking at the way we are allowing building to happen at the local level, and start thinking differently, maybe higher buildings with a smaller footprint, things like that. And it is a multidisciplinary type of approach, and people, like all of us, have different skills that we can bring to the table. So getting involved at the local level, whether it be through a land use commission or just participating in a public hearing or a public information session, is really important. Everybody has something to bring, and there's no better knowledge than the local knowledge that comes with the people who live there.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that, is I think while we're participating in these processes, it's important to think of what kinds of expertise and what disciplines aren't represented, because we all tend to kind of work together and know who logically should be there, but we really need to think about what other aspects to bring in. And I know Mary's from the Park River watershed, and I also think that we need to bring multiple generations into the conversation as well. And right now, the youth movement is so amazing and has so much energy. It's up to the people of our age to try and channel that energy in the best direction. And just to share with you a quote that a high school student wrote about Hartford and about the Park River watershed, which I thought just really represented everything that we're talking about today. So he said, "The North Branch has served the various communities that live around its muddy banks. Local native tribes hunted and fished along the waterway before it became a 17th century boundary between New Netherlands and New England. Today, it's a last landscape hidden within the capital city, a vivid glimpse of what once was a terrain of wild abundance. Growing up in the West End, I can attest to the powerful impact it had on my childhood. The riparian zone offered a space for my friends and I to escape the noise of Farmington Avenue and truly get lost in a quiet and serene natural space. Countless hours spent exploring the trails. These experiences are something I've often reflected on and see tangible evidence that it's created the person I am today. I hope it will continue to offer city residents a unique place rooted in a historic legacy and a fundamental community asset in the wake of global climate change." So, this is a high school student in Hartford. We need to make sure that we make the right decisions now so that we have this to offer to future generations.
Okay, we have a question over here. This is the final question.
Okay, sure. So the Governor's Council on Climate Change will soon be meeting to look at working in natural lands as one of the solutions, natural solutions for climate change. Just wondering if the panelists have any suggestions, recommendations, programs needed that might be helpful as that effort gets underway.
So that was actually, thanks Eric, because that was some of the things that I was hoping to get to say and ran out of time. So I think that Again, we are looking to incentivize natural climate solutions and land conservation and look at renewables in a way that's going to minimize impacts upon our natural lands. And so certainly we want to make sure that we continue to streamline the programs that we have in place that I already discussed, looking at better coordination between state and federal grant programs to make sure we are maximizing the dollars that we can bring to the table in a way that, again, is going to increase the pace of conservation and make sure we are strategically conserving the land. Quantifying and maybe maximizing the amount of carbon sequestration potential for our remaining lands. There are tools that are out there, they exist. It's not going to cost the state any money. So let's start to do that and really maximize the carbon potential of our state lands as well as our private lands. State tax incentives as well. We have a corporate income tax credit. We don't have anything for individuals who choose to donate or sell at a bargain land for conservation purposes. These are things that other states are doing. There are a number of types of incentives on how to better use our lands to maximize its carbon sequestration potential, whether for agriculture or for forest land. But we really need to be tapping into the benefits of land conservation and incentivizing it as best as we can. So those are just a few of the ideas I think that we can bring to the table. So thanks for asking the question.
I would just add, Eric, that I think the RGGI funds could be utilized to support urban tree planting and tree planting elsewhere, and that we should also be looking to ideas from the Green New Deal to create employment opportunities for those who are most vulnerable.
Public health.
Are we good with one more question, or?
We could do one more question. Katie
Okay.
Dykes is
There was one all the way back there, and Amy has a microphone.
Hold on, I got to turn it on for you. Is it on? Hello? Oh, wait.
It says, we hold it. There it is.
There you go. Can you hear me? I'm hoping that you can address the thing that I think is missing from the conversation, which is the idea of local investment in tropical reforestation. I work for an organization, a nonprofit in Mystic, Connecticut called Reforest the Tropics, and I teach kids about climate change. But I haven't heard you talk about the idea of investing in tropical reforestation, which is the only type of reforestation that will save us from the billions of tons of CO2 that are already in the atmosphere. Is there a way that you could say something about that?
Well, I think a lot of us are doing our part to try and contribute to that goal. But I'd also like to say there's a lot of new science about the power of temperate forests to sequester carbon. So our forests that we have here in New England can sequester between 2.3 and 4-point-something times the amount of carbon that they're sequestering now. So I think we kind of need an all-hands-on-deck solution in terms of forests around the globe. And some areas are suitable for proforestation, some areas are suitable for afforestation, so planting forests where they don't currently exist, and some areas are suitable for reforestation, regrowing forests. But if we want to talk about the most effective, rapid, and least costly thing we can do, it's protecting existing forests. So that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I would just add to that, I agree that the biggest problem for the loss of the deforestation in the tropics is from agriculture. And globally, the conversion of land that's going to become urban is outside the US. It's primarily in Asia and in Africa. The deforestation that's happening in the Latin American South is mostly from agriculture. So solutions in those areas, I think, Susan's just outlined them, that there's different ways of those approaches, but they're, I think, best conceived by people who live in those places.
I have a question, actually. Is there a public safety component to this as well? Because if police want to install cameras, they want to take the trees away so that they can watch people. Is that happening?
There are researchers at the U.S. Forest Service who have done a lot of work around looking at the relationship of tree cover and crime. And they found in Baltimore, for example, where there was a 15% increase in tree cover, there was a 10% drop in crime. But there is another part of that field that looks at, do sightlines get affected by vegetation? And so in terms of the police being able to kind of see and say hotspots or trouble areas, and they have found that it's really about shrubbery and other vegetation, it's not trees that are really problematic in terms of crime. But there's also the notion of, just like there's a broken window theory where you see abandonment and broken windows, you have an increase in crime. Where you see beautiful areas that are well tended with tree cover and well landscaped, you see people who are caring for the area, you have a drop in crime.
Thank you for answering that question for me. And I think there was a question, I saw your hand up first, and then I was so rude and I asked my question. So, Lori, is there a way we can get the microphone to this young lady with the beautiful scarf? I think it's a shade of purple. Over here.
California has endorsed the Tropical Forest Standard, which is a standard that qualifies countries around the Amazon to sell carbon credits to companies in the US like Amazon. And so California has adopted that. If more states can adopt that, perhaps we can, because the Amazon is like the lungs of this planet. So do you have any thoughts on that? And that's an answer to that gentleman's question.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not my area of expertise. I'll say there's many other faculty and staff at the Yale School of Forestry that work specifically on this area. They refer to it as being, having a readiness of understanding what it will mean to hold areas in, say, a conservation state of holding forest for carbon sequestration. And one critical piece of that is understanding what that will mean for people who live there. So what's their, what economic activity will support their livelihood when forests are held for that purpose for the North? So thinking about the U.S. asking other nations to hold their forest as a means of offsetting our energy consumption and ensuring that that ask that we make then is still supporting the livelihood of people who live in the regions that we're asking them to protect the forest based on our consumption. So how do we ensure that there's economic revenue that supports those communities for the long term? Because for those forests to serve the function, then they have to be held for the long term. That the forest carbon has to be held. So my response is that it's really critical that there's local voices in indigenous populations that are part of the decision-making process, that companies like Amazon being able to offset, and are they truly providing the benefit that those local communities will need to be able to sustain?
And there's a hand up over here. Amy's coming with the microphone behind you.
Where am I going?
Right here.
Thank you. One thing I'd like you to say something to is what I feel is the untapped power of the individual Connecticut resident who can plant a tree or a series of trees, reduce their lawn cover, and help to create kind of a continuous network of tap into the forests that are in their communities, their parks, and kind of create what Douglas Tallamy has talked about as a homegrown national park. And I feel like this is something that is so empowering to the individual. And I was hoping you could speak to that.
I'm so grateful that you raised this, because it was something I ran out of time to discuss. I think it's a very positive and powerful way that individuals, as you say, can take action that's positive, that not only addresses climate change, not only shades their house and reduces their own energy use, not only creates habitat, not only creates beauty, not only reduces crime, and it has so many, as you said earlier, multi-solving solutions for individuals to take a positive action of planting trees. I think we have a lot to learn from the health community in terms of behavioral change. Most of the environmental problems we face, we have created them, but it's like asking ourselves to go on a really hard diet of energy consumption. Change how we drive, change how we use energy. Planting trees is such a positive way. It doesn't feel like you're being asked to be put on the hard diet, but it engages people in something that gives them a lot of other positive benefits. We need to do both. We need to be on an energy diet, and we also need to plant more and change the way we, as thousands of landowners, have our piece that we can do our part.
You know, CLCC, I just put a one-pager in Lori's packet today, and if you flip over the back, it's just land and climate. There's a number of suggestions that go exactly to your point, and there's nothing more empowering than the power of one, is taking that action. It makes you feel good, and it does have an impact. Get involved with your local land trust, get involved with the local commission, plant that tree, do a pollinator garden, better yet, do a pathway. I mean, there are a whole lot of things, buy local. There are so many things that we as individuals can do, and I think that is a really terrific way to end the session.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists for being here today, and